Hello and welcome to American Government Seaside High School, Chapter 2, Section 2, The Coming of Independence. Again, want to remind you that our objectives for this section are on the blue butcher paper on the wall over there, so you can keep track as to what you're trying to learn this section as we go through the process. Here's what we're going to focus on. These are our objectives for today. What were Britain's colonial policies and how did the colonists react to them? What were the outcomes of the First and Second Continental Congresses? I want to remind you that the term Congress means a meeting. So continental would be continent like North America, South America, Africa. So we're looking at the First and Second Continental Congresses and what were their outcomes. And third, how did American independence come about and what were its effects? And this will be not only to the colonists, but more worldwide as well. Okay, objectives again are on the blue butcher paper on the wall. So as you see those things that you're trying to learn today, make sure you kind of check that off on your notes. And here we go. Until the mid-1700s, so basically what we're looking at here is from that 1607, 1620, when Jamestown and Plymouth started, until about the 1750s, so the mid-1700s, the colonies were allowed a great deal of freedom in their governments by the English monarchy. So what we're saying here is that the colonies, as we mentioned in Section 1, because of that distance between Great Britain and the colonies in America, were allowed to make a lot of their own decisions. As long as their decisions followed the guidelines of what the king had set in place, they weren't going to have any hassles. And as long as the king, in reality, as long as the king was generating taxes and generating revenue from the colonies and raw materials from the colonies, probably didn't really care what was happening in the colonies because the whole purpose of going out and colonizing these areas around the world was to generate resources for an island country that didn't have a lot of resources. So as long as those were coming in, didn't really care what was going on. And when you don't have consistency in your government or in your rule, then you're going to breed opportunities for others to learn a new or different type of lifestyle, and they might enjoy that more, which is kind of what happened here in the colonies, as they found out that self-government was a lot better than being governed by a king. So in 1760, King George III imposed new taxes and laws on the colonists. Of course, the question begs here, why would he impose new taxes? So if you think about that for a second, what I'd like you to do is to turn to your neighbor, and you'll get 30 seconds here to discuss why would the king impose new taxes? What might he need money for? So 30 seconds, and we'll start now. Okay, I'm going to give you a 5-second warning here. We'll come back. That's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so my teaching guest will pick on someone to share. And what I'd like to hear is two groups share what they discussed as to why would the king impose new taxes. So let's do that now. And hopefully, at this point, we've heard something about, obviously the king needs something to buy, because that's why he needed new taxes. And at this particular point in time in history, France and England had gone to war against each other. And of course, wars are extremely expensive, and so the king wanted to generate some more revenue. Now, if you were the king of England and you had a choice to raise taxes to the colonists or raise taxes to the people who lived in England itself on the island, which one would you choose? I mean, I think the king probably chose what he thought was best at that time. Let's tax the colonists. They're a long ways away. They're not going to raise up arms against me. They're not going to rebel. They don't have a standing army. Let's just tax them more than we tax the regular citizens of Great Britain. And that's exactly what he did. And of course, that really upset the colonists. So this tax really got people fired up. And of course, if you look at history, when you have a situation where a group of people have a common goal, they will unite even though they may not have the same philosophies about things like religion or political views. But the colonists now had something to unite on, and that was King George III. So the colonists started a confederation, which again is that loose league of friendship where the colonies began to start working together. They proposed an annual congress or an annual meeting, and they began to do things that were opposed to what the British government was focusing on. And the British government didn't really care. They wanted to impose those taxes, and if you can't get colonists to pay their taxes willingly, you send over your troops or you pay people to be mercenaries and go over and collect those taxes for you. So not only were troops used, but paid mercenaries were used to try to help bring in these taxes. Well, now you have basically a rule in the colonies where instead of having self-government, now it feels like you're being told to do even more and have less freedom. So basically, this is kind of that. As I've talked to you guys before, as seniors in high school, you're on that cusp of this sovereignty and moving out on your own and making your own decisions. This would be a lot like living on your own for a year and then moving back into the house and having to live by all those same rules that you did when you were in high school, as opposed to live by the rules that you've lived off of when you've been out of high school. So those, it's like, wait a minute, I've governed myself for a long time now. Why should I have to do these things that you're telling me to do? So that really upset the colonists because they were used to really self-government. They didn't want to have someone telling them what to do. So let's get out your A, B, C, D cards. And again, our guest teacher will look at you guys after I say respond, and we'll figure out where we're at. So the question is, by the mid-1700s, British rule in the colonies was marked by allowing a certain degree of self-rule to the colonists, imposing harsh and restrictive trade practices, passing increasingly high taxes, forcing the colonies to attack other colonial powers. Okay, if you will go ahead and respond at this time. Let's see what everybody has. I'll kind of look around the room here and give you a chance to make sure everybody's got their card up. All right. Now, if you really look at this question, this is why I picked this one out. It says by the mid-1700s. It doesn't say after the mid-1700s, by, which means before. We're looking at a time of self-rule by the colonies. After 1750 or after the mid-1700s, then we're really looking at a time of high taxes and restrictive trade practices. So the answer to this question is A, allowing a certain degree of self-rule to the colonists. All right, so let's go back to our notes. And let's look at growing colonial unity. So what was happening to bring those colonies together against the British government? And well, let's look at the early attempts here. So in 1643, we had several New England settlements form this New England Federation. So this is going to be in the northeast corner. We're talking about Vermont, Connecticut, New York, Maine. Those colonies were working together as they found if they worked together to solve some of the problems, it was a lot easier, and especially a lot easier financially, if you work together to solve problems. And some of those issues that they may be dealing with were Native American populations, sad to say, infringing on the homesteads of the colonists. Of course, the Native Americans were there first, so it's tough to say infringing upon. But they were a little upset that the Native Americans weren't adhering to the fences that were being put up and wouldn't move off to other pieces of land that were earmarked for the indigenous populations. We'll look at that confederation. Okay, it's a loose group that's joined together for common purpose. I've said this before. Hopefully you remember that it's a loose league of friendship. And then we go into the Albany Plan, and this particular plan is kind of named after the city of Albany, New York, and it was set up by Benjamin Franklin, and he got delegates from basically all of the colonies to come together and talk about issues. This is 1754. So the king hasn't started any taxes yet, any extra taxes. But what is happening is they were finding as a group, it was a lot better economically if they would work together in some of their trades with France and with Great Britain and other nations around the world. And they could deal with some of the problems that were happening with governments, but they could deal with them together. And they were learning that they could get along. And setting these things up helps the colonists bridge that gap for setting up their governments later on. And then the Stamp Act Congress comes about in 1765. So really what happens here is one of the taxes that was imposed by Great Britain in 1760 was a Stamp Act. And so any government document, a marriage certificate, a transfer title of a building or a home or a piece of property had to have a stamp put on it. Not a stamp like what we think of today, but like a seal. It would be a wax seal that would be put on there, and you would put a stamp on it with a device that would leave an imprint, much like an embossing. You guys will see this here in a few months. You'll get your diplomas, and on your diploma will be an embossed stamp from the Seaside High School, which will say that it's official because it has that stamp. So with that Stamp Act Congress, they got together to oppose the idea of having to pay this extra tax. And what they did is they sent delegates to Great Britain against these policies, and they declared this Declaration of Rights and grievances against this was sent to the king, and King George III said, okay, I see what you're saying. No taxation without representation. You've probably heard that before. I'll say it again. No taxation without representation was the argument that the colonists had. And they said, look, we are British citizens. Why are we being taxed more than the regular British citizens who live on the British Isles? And that question, must have made sense to a parliament at the time and Great Britain. As leader, the king, King George III, and so they revamped those taxes and removed them from the colonies, so they didn't have to pay this tax anymore. So the colonists, what it did is they learned that if they unified, worked together, and they brought their grievances or their concerns before the government through Parliament, that they were going to be successful. So it laid out a roadmap for them to argue against future transgressions by the British government. So time rolls on. Let's move now to 1774, 75, and King George has created some new taxes. Even though this was repealed in 1765. At this time, the British government starts to really impose some boycotts. The colonists start to boycott dealing with the British, and what was happening through most of the colonial period is the colonies were sending raw materials, like let's say lumber or wood, over to Great Britain, Great Britain would manufacture a table, send it back to the colonies, and then the colonists would buy that table. Well, over time, didn't want to wait around for things, the colonists start to manufacture their own goods. And as they start to manufacture their own goods, they don't see the need for Great Britain to be involved in the process anymore. Get rid of that middleman. And with that economic growth, the colonists being more self-sufficient in government, wanting a limited government more so than what the king was providing, and the taxes that were being thrown on top of the king led to this push for the colonies to really maybe break away and do their own thing. When the Second Continental Congress occurs in 1775, we basically have a time where British troops are on colonial soil. The battles of Lexington and Concord have already occurred in the spring of that year. There is a fight going on, and it's over all of those things that I was just listing out. The fact that the colonists are being taxed too much, that they don't have representation in government, they're not being treated like other citizens, they can't create their own materials with the raw materials that they have, their own finished goods, and so really the colonists are starting to feel like they're being treated as a second-class citizen in the British government. They're not being treated like the rest of the British citizens. So, in 1776 now, we have this Declaration of Independence, which we'll talk about here just in a moment. But you set up in the Second Continental Congress the opportunity for the colonies to come together and stand up against Great Britain and deny their allegiance to the British Crown at any further juncture. And on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence. And what we'll do at this particular point in time is we're going to stop this lecture and we'll watch a short reading of the Declaration of Independence. It's on a little videotape here, so it's going to take a second for us to transfer a couple of wires over so that we can run the VCR. But what you're going to see is a multitude of actors from various races, age groups, and genders. Some of them you may know, some may not. It's a little bit older video, but they're going to read the Declaration of Independence and almost perform it. The idea here with the Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson writes this document, is that it is going to be read in town squares because people couldn't read at this point in time on a regular basis. So it's going to be read to them. It's going to be read with emotion. It's going to be read with passion. And when you're going to hear this, lots of statements about he, and they're referring to the king and what he's doing negatively to the citizens. What this document is doing, it's trying to rally the American citizens, the colonists, to stand up against the most powerful country in the world at this particular point in time and fight for those rights, those beliefs that they have that they feel that have been taken away. So let's go to that video now. We'll have to hit pause on this presentation and come back to it in a few minutes. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the reading of the Declaration of Independence. They used lots of big words there. Transgressions, usurpations, basically, even without understanding a lot of what they were saying, I hope you got the feeling that it was basically saying how bad the king was and why the colonists should step up and fight for independence and a better way of government, a better lifestyle. And that was the whole crux of the Declaration of Independence. And remember, this is the document that really, for the first time, outlines that every person on the planet should have these unalienable rights, these things that they're born with, these restrictions from government taking their freedoms away. And this sets forth the idea of moving into our form of government that we have today. Between 1776 and 1777, most of the states adopt constitutions and get rid of these charters that they had. So again, A constitution is a document that is going to lay the foundation for the government. And they're doing this in a way that they believe, like New York is its own state, its own country. Rhode Island's its own country. Georgia's its own country. Virginia is its own country. And remember, we refer to those as states. So they all had to have constitutions to outline what their government would look like. How many branches would they have in their government? They all had 3 branches: legislative, executive, judicial. So, most of them had 2 house legislatures. And what we would call today in our Congress is the House of Representatives and the Senate. They had some type of 2 house legislature. They had some type of governor that was going to be elected and lead, and they had a judicial branch. A lot of the states put in their constitution some types of Bill of Rights to protect citizens from unjust governments. And if we look at the state constitutions, they all had a lot of really common features, as I was just discussing. And let's list those out. Popular sovereignty. So each state had this idea, principle of popular sovereignty, where they create a constitution and they could choose whatever type of government they wanted. If they wanted to have a king, they could have a king. If they wanted to have a representative government, they could have a representative government. Now, based on their most recent history and that idea of self-government, they're going to choose one that is going to uphold what the people want. The people wanted some type of self-government. Again, social contract theory, to bring something up from chapter 1. The idea of limited government, and that's that concept of rule of law. Say it again, rule of law. The idea that government has to follow the laws that everybody else has to follow, that they can't violate those laws just because they're the ones in power. And this was really critical in the building of these state constitutions. They wanted to protect the civil rights and the liberties of each person in their state. And so they came up with a Bill of Rights and listed out the types of rights that those people have. The due process, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, no quartering of troops, rights to search and seizure, a lot of things that you guys are probably used to hearing in the Bill of Rights. Well, this is where it first gets kind of put on papers in these state constitutions. And again, we're talking about 13 individual states that are planning on going it alone here shortly after the end of the Revolutionary War. This is 1781. And again, there's that term unalienable rights, as I was talking about in the Declaration of Independence. All right, we have separation of powers and checks and balances. So these are 2 things, and they're different, even though they are connected. Separation of powers divides government into 3 branches, and this is at each level. So when we look at federalism, we have the national level and the state level. At each of those levels, you divide the power up again between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and then the way those branches work together is what's called checks and balances. And that's how those branches work together to create any form of government or any action of government. It has to include those 3 branches in some way for things to get done. So just like if you had a group of friends and you have that one person in your group of friends who says, we're going to go to the movie tonight. They tell you where you're going to go and what you're going to do all the time. Now you might have a group of 3 people that are going to discuss what's going to happen, and that 2 of the 3 have to agree for you guys to ultimately settle on what it is that you're going to go do or go see. All right, get out your A, B, C, D cards, and we'll do a little formative assessment here as we finish up section 2. All right, the Declaration of Independence was signed in, was it 1765, 1776, 1781, or 1787? And respond. Again, our guest teacher will check the cards, and I'm willing to bet that almost everybody has chosen B, 1776. Great job. That was a pretty easy one, I hope. Okay. And our next question, the Stamp Act of 1765 was a law enacted by the British that, what did it do? Did it increase the colonists' taxes? Was it repealed by the Magna Carta? The colonists ratified 1 year later? Was it raise the price of a postage stamp by 2 cents? Give you a chance to think about that. and go ahead and respond. Okay, and our guest teacher is going to check out the cards. I'm hoping that you said it increased the colonists' taxes, and this was what really started to set off the colonists on a path of independence. Great, well that concludes section 2 of chapter 2, and we will have the opportunity to talk about section 3 here in the near future. Hope you guys are having a great day, and we'll look forward to talking with you soon.